This is Dr. Adriel Bowles of Hobnob Games, and this is the 12th tutorial of our beginner series where we'll be talking about player types. As always, you can find this tutorial along with all of our tutorials at hobnob.games, where you can also download and play on our live poker app. So today we'll be talking about player types. And so although there are lots of different strategies and styles that players have, you can basically take all poker players and put them fairly neatly into one of these 4 different player type categories. And the way we come up with these 4 different categories is based on 2 factors, starting hands and then their betting pattern. So let's start with starting hands. Starting hands, we can either categorize them as very loose. Very loose means that they don't need premium hands to see a flop. They'll take a hand like 10-7 suited, which is not really a premium hand, and they'll be willing to call with that pre-flop. So they see lots and lots of flops. They're very loose pre-flop. Or they can be more tight pre-flop, which means they're only playing premium hands. They fold the majority of their hands pre-flop because they're only going to play very strong hands. And we also look at their betting pattern. What do they do with these hands? If they're very passive, meaning they're mostly just going to check and call, then their betting pattern is very passive. But if they are doing lots of raising with their hands, then their pattern is much more aggressive. So the betting pattern is more, what do they do? Are they more passive with checking and calling, or are they more aggressive with lots of raising with the hands that they play? So let's take a closer look at each one of these 4 different player types. Let's start with the first one, loose passive, which is sometimes referred to as someone who's a calling station. They're a calling station because they constantly call. They rarely fold and they rarely raise. There are 3 options: fold, call, and raise. The vast majority of time, they're just calling. So they see lots of flops. So if we see a calling station or a loose passive player call pre-flop, they've got a lot of hands that they're probably playing. Everything from pocket aces and pocket twos all the way out to 5-4 suited, ace-2 offsuit. They're going to play a wide variety of hands pre-flop. What do they do with these hands? They play them very passively. So again, they're mostly just call. They rarely raise. When they do raise, be very afraid. If you see a loose passive player or a calling station suddenly getting aggressive with their hand, that usually, in fact, almost always means they have a very, very strong hand at that point. So again, if they break their pattern of passiveness and suddenly become aggressive, that's a cue to you that they most likely have a very strong hand. So one thing we want to do is not bluff these players because they constantly call. They have trouble finding the fold button. This is not a player type that you want to try to bluff very often, because what are they most likely going to do when you try to bluff? They're going to call. But when we do have a good hand against them, we want to value bet them relentlessly. So don't hold back. Don't sit there and be scared and say, I don't want to bet too much and possibly blast them off the pot. It's still a risk you're going to take, but err on the side of betting big and not holding back, because if they mostly call, well, you don't want to bluff them, but if they're going to call, then when you do have a good hand, then you want to bet. You do not want to slow play, bet, and bet often. So value bet these players relentlessly. Now, if you're thinking about playing a loose passive style, I strongly recommend against this. This is typically a losing style. If you play a wide variety of hands pre-flop, that means you have a lot of weak cards in your hand. And weak hands pre-flop make a lot of weak hands post-flop. And what do they do with these weak hands post-flop? Call. That is not a winning strategy. This is typically a losing strategy in poker. In fact, you want lots of calling stations at your table. If you're sitting at a table with lots of calling stations, stay at that table. This is probably the most profitable player type for you to be able to play against. All right, let's take a look at one of the other player types, the loose aggressive. So loose aggressive, sometimes called a lag player. So these are the players that, in a more extreme version of lag, is sometimes we refer to as a maniac player. So lag players are either maniac players or bordering on maniac. So they're loose. So the loose part is pre-flop. They see lots and lots of hands, just like our loose passive. So they see lots and lots of hands pre-flop. But what would they do with these hands is very, very different. The loose passive calling station is just going to play them very passively. The lag plays these hands very aggressively. So they're taking lots of hands, including lots of weak hands, and they're being very aggressive with these cards. So they're constantly raising and they're constantly looking for opportunities to bluff. So the way we want to counter against this strategy, if you have a lag at your table, then what you want to do is be patient, wait to make a strong hand, and when you make a strong hand, trap them. You trap them by just pretending that you have a weak hand. Because what will they do if they think you have a weak hand? They'll fire big and try to bluff you off of it. So let them use that constant aggression against them by trapping them when you have a strong hand, and then let them do all the betting, and you can just call them down, and then maybe on the river when you finally get a chance, then you can shove all in. But if you want to consider playing a lag style, it can be a winning style if you do it well. I've seen good lags and I've seen bad lags. The bad lags, they end up costing themselves a lot of money. You're not very good at being able to read when you can bluff people off the hand, when they genuinely are weak and you can just be a bully and push them off your hand. If you can do that well, then you can play this lag style and have a winning poker style with this. But if you're not very good at that, if you're not good at being aggressive, not good at reading your opponents and knowing when they're weak, knowing when you can push them off their hand, and then similarly, knowing when to hit the brakes, knowing when they're probably trapping you, they're disguising the strength of their hand by trying to trap you. If you can sniff that out and suddenly hit the brakes when you need to, then you can play the lag style well. But also just know that if you play this style, it's going to be high variance. You're not always going to be right. Sometimes your bluffs don't work. Sometimes your bluffs do work in very big pots. So just know you're going to have lots of high variance, lots of ups and lots of downs. Third player type is tight passive. So this player type is oftentimes referred to as a rock player. And I think this is a suitable name for this player type because they're like a rock. So they're tight pre-flop, so they don't see a lot of hands. Pre-flop, they're only playing premium hands. If it's anything other than a premium hand, they're just folding pre-flop. So this is a player who's not in the action very much. They spend the vast majority of their time at the table just folding their hand pre-flop because they're very tight. But then what do they do with this strong range of hands? They play them very passively. So again, they're mostly just checking and calling and rarely raising. So what do we want to do against these players? We want to bluff against them relentlessly because their whole strategy is just sit, be patient, and wait until you have a really strong hand, and then you can put a bunch of money in the middle. Well, the hole in this strategy is that it's hard in poker to make a strong hand. And if you wait for strong hands pre-flop, you still miss the flop the vast majority of the time. So they're just going to fold a whole lot. They're easy to push around. They're easy to bully. So bully them. So bluff against these players relentlessly. But when they play back at you, when they suddenly, make a big bet or call a big bet, that is a huge cue to you that they have a very strong hand. So be afraid when they do suddenly put a large amount of money in the pot. They never do that unless they have a very, very strong hand. So we want to bluff against them, but get ready to hit the brakes because as soon as they play back, unless you have a monster hand, you want to just get out of there. This is a fairly low share of the total winning players in poker. You can play this style winning, but you're never going to be a big winner. They're never going to be a big loser, but they're never going to be a big winner either. So these are the players who, if you want to take on this style and just be very, very patient, you could probably grind out a small profit if you could do this well. But you're never going to be one of the best players at the table because your strategy is just too easily exploited by better players. But you're also going to have low variance. So if you want to play poker, but you're just not into the gambling, you don't like the big ups and the big downs, this is a low variance style of play. This might be for you. And the last of the player types we're going to be talking about is a tight aggressive, or sometimes called a tag player. Now in the lower stakes poker, so that includes the 1-2, 1-3, and 2-5 games, this is probably the most winning style that you could, the most likely of the playing styles, the one that's most likely to be a winning style. So it's tight and it's aggressive. So just like the rock, this player sees very few flops. They're going to spend the vast majority of their time at the poker table just folding garbage hands pre-flop. They're going to be patient, disciplined, and wait for the stronger hands. But then what do they do with these hands once they have them? They play them very aggressively. And I think that this is the right way to play, because if you're going to be disciplined, you're going to put all that time and effort into just waiting around for good hands. But once you have a good hand, it's like that gives you a license to now go be aggressive with the hand. You waited and waited for a strong hand. Now you have a strong hand. Do something with it. I don't think it's the time to be passive. It's time to be aggressive. And that's why this tends to be more of a winning poker style. So tag players, when they get their strong hands, then they then play them very aggressively by rarely ever checking and calling with them, mostly putting in raises with these hands. And again, this is generally a very winning strategy, especially at the lower stakes in poker. It's also fairly difficult to exploit. It's difficult to exploit because when you only play strong hands pre-flop tend to make strong hands post-flop. So they're not easy to bully because even though they're waiting for strong hands, they have a strong hand. Good luck trying to bully them and make them fold their stronger hands. So it's difficult to exploit. Now, they can be exploited by more advanced strategies that we'll get into in our more intermediate series. But for at low stakes, these players can be difficult. They're definitely the most difficult to exploit of the 4 player types we're talking about today. So in summary, if we're talking about player types, most poker players can fit neatly into one of these 4 categories. I think one decision you want to make as a poker player is, what style do I want to take on? What am I most comfortable with? What style do I think I can best execute? So think about your personality, think about what you're comfortable with, and pick a style. But just know that each of these styles has strengths, but they also have weaknesses. So be aware of what your weaknesses are and how other players might try to exploit your playing style. But probably more importantly, what this is about today is knowing against your opponents, knowing what their different playing styles are. And if you know their playing style, you'll know what their strengths are, what to stay away, how and what situations to stay away from this player and just fold, and how they're exploitable. Where are the holes in each of their strategies? And so what's the appropriate counter strategies to help to take advantage of the weaknesses in each of their playing styles? So next time we're going to be talking about playing position. So as always, you can find this video along with all of our tutorials at hobnob.games. I will see you next time.